So I guess I want to start just by diving in and looking at basically the last year and a half, what the time period that people have been calling the racial reckoning. Because, we are more than a year out now from kind of the beginning of the protests, which of course were sparked by the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the police murder of other Black people. And the reason why I want to get your thoughts is because, even before this, the kind of year of racial reckoning, you were a pretty early critic of some of the rhetoric and the tendencies that you saw coming out of Black Lives Matter in its previous iterations. And I actually want to read a line from the beginning of, or the opening of your 2017 Catalyst article, which is "The Panthers Can't Save Us Now." You write, "Instead of a left politics predicated on anti-racism and racial affinity, this essay urges a popular anti-capitalist politics rooted in situated class experiences as the only viable means for ending the policing crisis and guaranteeing genuine public safety." So if we're, I think that essay holds up great, but I think, if we're looking back at the last year and a half or the time between when the essay came out and now, lots of people have pointed out that, we have not, these protests have been huge. I really do think something has changed, and so I'm wondering from you, does the last year and a half change your analysis at all?
So it doesn't necessarily change my politics. It does
Hmm.
prompt a different kind of interpretation of what's transpired, right? So there were people who were downright giddy with the George Floyd protests in terms of having that moment where they could say to all of us who have been critical, look at how wrong you were, right? And so we're still dealing with that on some level. But at the same time, I mean, I think now that we've had now that the owl of Minerva, so to speak, has spread its wings, we should be able to look at what transpired last year a bit more critically and maybe with some sober eyes. Let me say a couple of things. I don't think it was all for naught or that it was inconsequential. And I said this to people at the time. I actually think that if we think about longer historical process, it mattered, and we don't know how it's going to matter ultimately, right? I mean, in the midst of the George Floyd protests, I remember walking down my street and encountering a group of small kids, probably all under the age of 10, unattended by adults, scribbling out Black Lives Matter on the sidewalk and other slogans. And I thought to myself for a moment, like, well, what is this going to mean for these kids, right? Like, we all have a different perspective based on our engagement over the last few decades, but we don't really know how it's going to matter over the longer haul. So I think that would be the way I would start. That I'm critical of what happened, and I'm going to offer some more criticisms in a second. But I just think we have to, do both at the same time. Look at these moments as galvanizing. Look at them as moments where certain segments of the population become politicized and begin to learn, what they want and clarify what kinds of things they want and desire, and also learn how to be political, right? And so I think I don't see it as a beginning or an ending. I just see it as part of a longer historical process. The other thing I would say, critically, I don't think everything we witness should be reduced to a victory of Black Lives Matter. I think on one level, of course, the George Floyd murder was the precipitating event, and so many people turned out to express their discontent with, not just the Minneapolis police, but also, so many of the other police killings that had happened over the course of last year. At the same time, we could also say that this was a protest against the Trump administration, right? It was a moment in which people expressed their outrage at the mishandling of the COVID pandemic, right? It was also, as one of my good friends, Donnell Walton, who's a physicist and a material scientist, pointed out at the time, we could also look at the events of the George Floyd protests as the return of the third space, right? We all were denied that social space beyond our households and our workplaces, right? We were denied that during the shelter in place. But in this moment of the George Floyd protests, you saw people returning to the streets, congregating en masse. It provided us with a permissible moment and an opportunity to re-engage with the public, to reunite with friends, to celebrate. And a lot of these protests had a festive feel to them. And so I think we can't really just speak in such simplistic terms. Of course, for diehard, anti-racists, this was like their moment. But if we look at it again with a critical eye, by the end of the summer, much of the public support for Black Lives Matter had dissipated. So there was a short window when a slim majority of Americans embraced the basic premise of Black Lives Matter. That's that, Black people are over-policed. Black people are much more likely to be subjected to police violence and death. Most Americans embrace that for a short moment. But by the time we get to the end of the summer and the Jacob Blake shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, some of that support unraveled. We could also argue that the huge outpouring of people in the streets in terms of mobilization is not the same as a new consensus around a particular kind of policing that would be different from what we already have. Most Americans still support police. Most Americans don't want to see police budgets cut. And it's been difficult over the last year to actually see some of those really strong reform measures enacted in different cities. We've seen a lot, but we haven't seen some of the key cornerstones of the most progressive to radical Black Lives Matter forces. So again, I just think we have to take a much more sober perspective on it, and hopefully the passage of time will allow some people to get there.
So I want to follow that up by asking you about, earlier in the show, we were talking about the New York mayoral race. I don't know if you've been following it that closely, but Eric Adams, who, is a former police captain who kind of ran on a law and order platform, didn't just avoid the defund question, but actually actively pledged to refund the police. And in fact, reinstate a pretty controversial, special task force that the de Blasio administration had gotten rid of. Well, so in yesterday's election, he did really well, not just citywide, but specifically in Black working class neighborhoods like Brownsville, again, East New York, Flatbush. I pointed out Thompsonville, the neighborhood in Staten Island where Eric Garner was killed, also voted heavily for Eric Adams. So when we were talking about this, I was like, well, this is Cedric's wheelhouse. This reminded me a lot of, your comments on how racial identity is not the same as a constituency, and that's not the same as a political commitment. So can you talk a little bit about where you see the kind of disjunct between the rhetoric around policing and what played out in the New York mayoral election?
Well, let's just start with Adams as a figure, right? He's a charismatic guy. He also gets to pull on certain kinds of identity traits or experiences that a lot of people think are valuable. The fact that he has been victimized by police before. He has been a police officer at the highest rank. And he's somebody who knows how to speak the language. There's a great quote from him, actually, from the midst of the George Floyd protests, where he begins to talk about why so many whites are out in the streets. And it's really poetic, right? This was on a television appearance or interview he gave to CBS. I can't remember if it was on 60 Minutes or CBS Sunday Morning, one of their shows that some of your audience may not watch. But the quote that he had was brilliant. It was like, a lot of these people are out in the streets now because they're feeling Black. Right? They realize they don't have health insurance. They realize that they have advanced education, but they can't find a job. They know that their future is uncertain. And so he keeps repeating that, they're feeling Black. So he was able to take what is our dominant way of thinking about inequality in the society since the 1950s, at least, right? This idea that class doesn't matter so much, but we know that race does, right? Which is kind of a Cold War creation, which we're still stuck with. And I think he has that, sort of like Obama and other figures, he has that capacity to shuttle back and forth between an authentic presentation of an anti-racist politics and a familiarity that some people can appreciate, clearly some of the Black voters in the boroughs. And at the same time, be completely committed to the society as it exists, the neoliberal urban growth regime that we have in most cities, as well as the role that police have played in shoring up the conditions for that pro-growth regime to work. And so I think he's just, he's a charismatic figure. It's not surprising that in this moment of the George Floyd protests, or in the wake of it, we've seen, the quick ascendancy of all these different political figures like Gary Chambers, Adams and others, right? And I'm not knocking them. I think actually some of these figures are better than the alternative, right? And I think we have to take it on a case by case basis. But what it shows us is how the language of anti-racism, which, let's just be honest, I think it actually mischaracterizes, and I've said this many times before, it mischaracterizes the fundamental motives of our carceral regime, right? It actually mischaracterizes its origins, it mischaracterizes its motives, and it mischaracterizes its impact in the society overall. But what it does, in sort of making this assertive anti-racist claim, it sets up the possibility for all sorts of ascendant politicians, as well as brokers who claim to speak on the behalf of the broader aggrieved population.
So, there's been this steep rise in violent crime. I mean, for a while now, but especially since COVID. So with this rise, many progressives are pushing for policies of, quote, violence prevention. So this has taken many different forms. Some of this focused deterrence policing, public health intervention, or like funneling money to nonprofits and community groups that work on ending gun violence. So what do you think of some of these approaches? Do you think this gets at the root causes of gun violence or police violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't. I mean, it's been shown to have some impact, right, in certain places, and I think this is where it's tough to be socialist or to be on the left, right, and engage in these issues, right. On the one hand, we definitely need to acknowledge that for people who live in neighborhoods where there's high levels of violence, and not just homicides, but all sorts of other conflicts which leave people in the hospital or permanently maimed, right? Or even dealing with all sorts of, psychological trauma, that sort of experience needs to be rectified. And if there's any sort of way that these strategies that people are talking about literally stop the bleeding, right? And reduce the amount of misery that some people are living with, I think we should support it. At the same time, and I think in this regard, I'm more in the mind of Frederick Engels, right, in his book, The Housing Question. When we focus too intently on policing, right, we forget what is connected to it. This is a secondary evil, right, that the whole point of policing and the type that we have, which grew out of the post-war urban transformation, which resegregated cities more strictly in racial and class lines than they had been before. The point of policing is then to manage a large, unemployed, underemployed, and alienated, mostly Black, but also brown and sometimes white working class population. That is the function of it. And it's necessary if all of the things that people like Eric Adams want are going to happen within cities. And that's the return of investment, the renewal of middle-class consumer spaces, the attraction of various middle-class and wealthy residents and tourists back to the city. If all of those things are going to happen in San Francisco and Los Angeles and Chicago, Philadelphia and elsewhere, police play an important role, right? So it's not just about the role of police in interrogating and harassing Black people writ large. It is a targeted set of strategies which focus primarily on the most dispossessed and the most alienated segments of the Black population, right? And so we have to be clear about that. If the strategies you're talking about work, that's fine. But I think ultimately we need to be about a different kind of abolition, which is the abolition of the conditions that police are there to manage.
So I want to quickly rewind and take a look at an article you wrote last year about corporate blackwashing, because I think, Don't Let Blackwashing Save the Investor Class. It's a great article in Jacobin. And I think, again, a year and a half out from the initial protests, I think a lot of people on the left have been, like yourself, critical of kind of the corporate response as they see it to Black Lives Matter and to the protests. But I think a really interesting piece about your article is you don't see it as simply a matter of co-optation. And I think that is something that we hear on the left a lot, right? That corporations are simply co-opting an authentic grassroots anti-racist movement. And I think in your piece, you argue that the relationship or what's going on is a little bit more complex. So can you talk a little bit about why co-optation is not quite the right frame for what's happening between the corporate response to Black Lives Matter?
Right. So there's a book that might be relevant. Some people may want to return to it by Thomas Frank, called The Conquest of Cool, which was, I think, basically the book that came out of his dissertation thesis. But it's really great for looking at how corporations responded to 60s counterculture and really embraced the style, the aesthetics, the messaging, appropriated those for their own purposes of expanding their market share and improving their profitability, right? Reaching different kinds of consumers. And so the strategy was no longer about talking about the merits of their products, but more so about associating that product with rebelliousness, right? And with really a rejection of the status quo, rejection of hierarchy, even as it was contributing to corporate profit making. And so that book is about the 1960s. There are other people like Robert Allen, who was writing, at the very sort of tail end of Black Power, about the machinations of corporations at that particular time. And so this is not a new set of dynamics, right? What we're looking at right now is not co-optation in the sense of corporations need to step in and restore order. We're looking at corporations doing what they've been doing and really refining what they've done, at least, in my entire lifetime, right? So for the last 50 years, they've been doing the same thing, right? Finding ways to support a particular kind of anti-racism, demonstrating their commitments to diversity in terms of race, class, gender, sexuality, and other categories. And so this is not a new thing, but it's an opportunity for these corporations. We could also say as well that even the protests we associate with Black Lives Matter have always had an interesting relationship with corporations, right? And so let's take one of the most important, an iconic protests, right? If you look at Colin Kaepernick when he was quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, taking a knee in protest of police violence. So Kaepernick loses his job because these owners, shy away from hiring him, right? The fear is that they would have this rebellion from their rabid racist fans, and then it would mean problems, at the box office, right? So Kaepernick basically parlays that into a pretty lucrative deal with Nike, right? And all of a sudden you begin to see Kaepernick billboards across different cities. Again, expressing this idea of the rebelliousness, right? The rejection of a corrupt order, which is totally facile, right? The same thing was true with Beyonce Knowles' performance at the Super Bowl around the same time, right? I mean, she not only decides to work with an organization that had spurned Colin Kaepernick, but then she also, adorns herself in the symbolic reference of Black Power, even as she's helping to advance this broader spectacle of the Super Bowl and help to restore the image of the NFL in the midst of various protests coming from Black publics and broader publics. And so I just think it's interesting that we assume that these things are so separate and antagonistic, but in fact, they're not. And we can also say that some of the organizations that we associate with Black Lives Matter were born out of nonprofit funding. Many of them have benefited from nonprofit and philanthropical support. And in saying that, I'm not arguing that that is completely corrupt, right? I mean, I think there's moments when people have relationships with nonprofits that can be somewhat productive, but we shouldn't work from this illusion that there's authentic rebellion over here, and then a corrupt corporate world somewhere on the other side, right? That's waiting to prey on them. The picture is much more complex, and we should be aware of those complexities.
Mm-hmm. So, following from that, that I guess in some of your work, you have identified this concept which you call militant liberalism or militant racial liberalism. And I think at first militant liberalism kind of sounds like a contradiction, right? But I think it's related to the dynamic that you're just discussing. And so I was wondering, can you explain what that means and why this concept is important for thinking about kind of some of the contradictions of the current movements for racial justice? Or like, how does this concept help us think through our current political moment?
Right. So one way to think about it, right? So if we think about the post-war civil rights movement and its successes as a second Reconstruction, the restoration of the Black vote, Black participation within civic affairs, as well as major investments by the federal government, as well as those corporations and foundations I mentioned before, in reducing Black poverty and trying to address various urban problems. If we think about the second Reconstruction, I mean, it achieved some important things. From the 1954 Brown decision until the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, we saw Black poverty greatly reduced, right? So at the time of the Brown decision, 60% of African Americans lived below the poverty line. That number will be greatly reduced by the time I graduated from high school in 1989, and then went on to grad school in the 90s, right? So I just think that we have to be aware of the progress that was made, but at the same time, be aware of the limitations, that it didn't completely eliminate poverty. It didn't deal with the problems of structural unemployment. It didn't deal with the hyper-segregation of, again, those most dispossessed segments of the Black working class in cities and small towns across the country. And so the second Reconstruction had limits, and people like King and others were talking about those limits in the 1960s, right? It wasn't like I'm not saying anything that's new, right? People knew this as it was transpiring. Add to that the fact that all of the gains that were made were rolled back by way of neoliberalization, right? And so we've seen many of the things that provided Black people with some sort of advance and helped to expand the ranks of the Black middle class. It helped to provide people with more in the way of unionized jobs through public sector employment. All of those different mechanisms, again, coming out of the second Reconstruction, have been weakened as a result of neoliberalism, right? Some of the first institutions to be attacked by Republicans, but also by New Democrats, have been the very ones that have supported, Black advancement. And so now we're in a moment, by the time Barack Obama is elected, we're in a moment when Black middle class people are hurting. They're hurting as a result of the loss of public sector employment. They're hurting as a result of the subprime mortgage crisis. Working class and poor Blacks are hurting because of the ways in which the old social safety net is now being eviscerated and ripped out from underneath them. And so Black Lives Matter as a notion arises at the precise moment that it captures these different, felt needs and different experiences, right, of reversal, right, the loss of that second Reconstruction. And so it's militant in tone when we listen to the things that people are saying, various speakers at these rallies. It's militant in terms of tone, but all people are calling for essentially is the restoration of those same things that were lost, right? Making sure that Black people who qualify for a mortgage can actually purchase a home where they want without being discriminated against. Making sure that people who attain a certain level of education can have approximate income and other benefits like their white peers. A lot of the things that we're hearing, not just from Black Lives Matter, but from cognate social formations and campaigns like reparations or discussions about disparities, is really about, restoring the second Reconstruction. And now you hear some people talking about a third Reconstruction, really just sort of restoring the idea of racial liberalism, right, and racial justice. So it's not really radical. It may be presented in strident tones, but it's really very similar to a lot of the arguments that we've heard in earlier periods.